is Bruno Falissard, that all of you know. Bruno Falissard is professor of child and adolescent psychiatry. He is a biostatistician, works in a very big and very well-known research lab in Paris area. And as you know, he's also the past president of the IACAPAP, the International Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So he has a huge experience and will have us all benefit from that, because his talk will be on teaching research organization, what future for child and adolescent psychiatry. It's about to redefine our roles for the next decades, maybe. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you. Everything is okay? Thank you. It will be a free speech and not consensual. So I am sure that colleagues or students will disagree, and this is the objective. If we agree every day on everything, this is suspect. First, my disclosure. I work for many pharmaceutical firms. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I am French, and so this is a specificity for the question of training. I have been trained as an adult psychiatry. Then I became a child and adolescent psychiatry, and we will come back to that later. You know that this is not the same in all European countries. I am a biostatistician, and so I am biased as regards numbers and data and all these sort of things. I do my clinics in a university department, so I don't see patients that my colleagues see in their private practice in the city, which is also a bias. I like psychoanalysis, which is curious for many of you, I'm sure. But that's life. Even if the theory can appear a little bit strange, it helps me a lot for my practice. And sometimes I am skeptical about neuroscience, which means that I love neuroscience when I am in meetings to listen to the new discoveries. This is fascinating, but I don't understand the utility of that every day. And I say that because perhaps it will bias me also as regards what we have to teach and what we will have to learn in child and adolescent psychiatry. Okay, this is the outline. First, if we want to plan the future of our discipline, we have to do an evaluation of the burden of disease in child and adolescent psychiatry. And the good news is that nowadays we have data about that. Now, after we will try to see the classical problems that are... I have forgotten my watch, which is something mandatory. The apparent problems that we face, that everybody knows. And we will try to see the solution that we actually, at the moment, attempt to propose against this apparent problem. Then we will tackle the unseen problem. And you know, as psychiatrists, that the unseen problem in general are much more important to tackle than the apparent problem. And then we will terminate by the solution for the unseen problem. Now, concerning the burden of child and adolescent psychiatric disease, there has been some news concerning child and adolescent psychiatry only in the very recent years. You know, in the past, public health professionals were only dealing with death. And most of diseases in child and adolescent psychiatry do not kill children, fortunately. And so our disease had no impact on public health because there is no death. And 20 years ago, WHO, the World Health Organization, supported a new vision of burden of disease, which integrates number of lost years due to early death, as usual, with number of lost years due to ill health or disability. And of course, you can imagine that it changed completely the relative importance of all disease. So they did statistics about that, even in pediatrics, but mental disease for children and adolescents were merged with neurological disease, which is a symptom. Anyway, 3 or 4 years ago, they split neurological disease with mental disease. And now we have statistics about the global burden of disease by medical specialties in pediatric population all across the planet. And you can see, if we focus in Europe, which is your main interest, that mental diseases are in the first position. And even in second position, you have unintentional injury. And you know that unintentional injury sometimes are related to impulsivity, which is related to some mental disorder. And this is the same in America. Of course, in Africa, infectious diseases are very important. And you can see, interestingly, when the gross domestic product of a country increases, the relative part of mental disease in children and adolescents increase. And so that we can expect that even in Africa, in 10, 20 or 30 years, it will be the same than in Europe. Anyway, and so there is, of course, it shows to politicians, which is very important, that if we want to deal with problem of youth, we have to deal with mental disorder. This is just data. We have to interpret correctly this data. Many people interpret that in saying why mental diseases are increasing in our countries and how all our kids are becoming crazy. And if you look at very good epidemiological studies, the NCS Adolescent Supplement, an American study, Americans are very good. I criticize often them, but to do epidemiology, they are real champions. In this study, the lifetime prevalence of mental disorder in adolescents is about 50%, which means that about 1 youth on 2, up to the end of his or her adolescence, will have a mental disease. And about 1 on 4, 1 on 5 with severe impairment. This is very impressive. And so when you have something very impressive, you have to ask yourself, is it true? This is even more important as I did the estimation, if this is true. If you have to propose evidence-based treatment to all these youths who have a mental disorder, then in France, all psychotherapists should deal only with children and adolescents. And the problem is that if you say that to a politician, if you say, wow, look at, this is a disaster, half of our youth have mental disorder, he will look at you and say, okay. If it is true, we can do nothing. So I suspect this is not true. And the politician will be right, in fact. He will be right because there is a drawback with these figures, and there has been a very beautiful paper of Spitzer, who was died recently. He was one of the creators of the DSM, a very bright, very important people for psychiatry during the 20th century. He wrote a paper in the Archive of General Psychiatry which said psychiatric diagnoses and need for treatments are not the same. In fact, it should have been entitled Epidemiological Psychiatric Diagnoses and Need for Treatment are not the same. In epidemiological study, you count people that are strange. That are strange, it means that some people have asked them a couple of questions and they rate for many of these questions that correspond to the DSM. But it does not mean that these guys correspond to the people you see in your consultation. Yeah. You know the difference. Yeah. There is a difference. So this is interesting to do these studies because you can find risk factor, you can compare girls and boys, adolescents to children, etc., etc. But the prevalence are difficult to interpret. And this is not proper to psychiatry. If you consider knee arthrosis, after 40 years old, 50% of the population have clinical and radiological symptoms of knee arthrosis. But this does not mean anything. You are not going to put a knee prosthesis to half of the population. This is meaningless. So you see. So you have to be very careful with epidemiological prevalence of mental disease. These are difficult to interpret. Another point is that indeed the relative part of mental disease was not that high in the past in Europe. But this is because somatic disease have decreased and mental disease have been stable. And so the relative proportion of mental disease has increased. And even mental disease slowly decrease in Europe at the moment. If you look at objective data, which are consumption of cigarettes, alcohol, cannabis, tranquilizer, which are correlated to mental disease, as you know. We have very solid European data about that. And you can see that in the last 10 years, cigarette and alcohol slowly decrease, and cannabis is stable. So there is no disaster with child and adolescent psychiatry. We have to know that, because sometimes we are tempted to say everything is bad and there are mental disorders everywhere, and we are going to see in a couple of minutes that when we say that, we do wrong. We do the opposite. We obtain the opposite of the result that we want. Okay, so have a look at the apparent problem that prevent to deal appropriately with this disease, because there is one constatation that you can do all across the planet. By far, we have not enough money to treat our patients. By far. You could say cancerologist, pediatrician, cardiologist could say the same. No. There are data about that? No. In rich country, there is no problem of money to treat cancer in the pediatric population. But this is not the same if you consider Hodgkin disease. In France, we treat Hodgkin disease like that, in a week. Anorexia nervosa, half of the population of severe patients with anorexia nervosa in France are at home with their parents at the moment. And the life expectancy of anorexia nervosa is the same as Hodgkin disease. So you see that there is really a problem. And France is now a low and middle income country at the moment. And so this is even worse for the poorest country. So there is indeed a problem about that, and we have to understand why. So these are the apparent problems, very classical. The first one is the curse of care. Indeed, our treatment relies a lot on speech, on being with children, with parents, and it seems like care. And in a way, psychological treatment, psychotherapies are a form of very sophisticated care, very technical, but this is apparently to a care. And you know, American sociologists have learned a lot of that. In our societies, this is really the case in all the planet. There is a curse of care, which corresponds to the fact that care should be free, this is natural, and women have to do care. And so you know that women are not paid for medicine in many countries. I don't see that because most of you are women. This is just reality. And so because care is free, women and mother should provide care, and child and adolescent psychiatry is care, so this is not medicine, and so we should not pay for that because this is just natural. And this explains a huge amount of variance of the fact that politicians do nothing. Religion also. I didn't imagine that, but I saw in some country, in Gaza Strip, for instance, we had a problem with the Ministry of Health who wanted to stop that MSF provide psychological treatment for PTSD in children. They say, no, it is to the imam and to the mother to treat PTSD. And we had to discuss, and the good news is that we can discuss, even with the Vice Minister of Religion of Gaza Strip. You can do that. You always can discuss with politicians. And of course, we are fascinated by high-tech treatment. At the moment, our country spends a lot of money with the monoclonal antibody. They work a little bit, but we pay them much too much, much too much. More than 100,000 euros for a medication for a cancer each year, for a monoclonal antibody, which gives about 3 to 4 months of expected survival in addition. Imagine what you could do with 100,000 euros with your patients. But this is high-tech treatment, and so that's life. The ambivalence toward kids and adolescents, this is something we have to have in mind, and we know that because of our practice. When you go to politicians, when you speak on the TV, everybody is supposed to love kids. You know, this is very important, the future generation, we have to be kind with them, and blah blah blah, and they are so cute, and etc. etc. But you know that all parents at a given moment have the fantasy that if they could drop their kids by the window, it would be something fantastic. And this is normal life, you know. Winnicott wrote many pages about that, and it explains intrafamilial violence and many things like that. And this is, you know, about adolescents. Right. We could speak a lot about the relationship between adolescents and adults. Anyway, another point also is that in France we have the Téléthon, which is a TV show to give money for Duchenne myopathy. People pay a lot of money. If you do a video show for children who have conduct disorder, you will not have that much money. And and you know that this is very difficult to say that in fact they have mood dysregulation, they are impulsive, and so they appear as delinquent. And in fact this is much more complex than that. But how do you want to explain that? This is only the parents can understand after a certain time. And even the teacher, this is very difficult. So, okay, we have to deal with that. And of course, there is also anti-psychiatry. That's life. There is anti-psychiatry for adult psychiatry, and there is also anti-psychiatry for child and adolescent psychiatry. You know, many people consider that children and adolescents cannot have mental disorders. This is just impossible because naturally they are happy. They have no boss. They have not to go to the office every morning, but they have to go to school. They have a teacher, they have parents. You know that many people still now consider that mental disease in children are invention. ADHD is invention. Depression do not exist in it. We can discuss about that, but you can use the same argument to say that leukemia is not a disorder. You know, we can discuss about the construction of disease in medicine. This is a real subject. You know, breast cancer is going to disappear. There will be in the future HER cancer, KRAS cancer, you know, with genotypes. And so the localization of the cancer will disappear. I agree that diseases are construction in a way, but in whole medicine, not only in psychiatry. Anyway. So, what we did about that, I think, the idea was quite good. For the curse, we said that even psychological treatment, even psychodynamic treatment, they are now evidence-based. Of course, this is not so simple. It is much easier to show that treatment are evidence-based in adult psychiatry than in child and adolescent psychiatry, because in adult psychiatry they can select patients aged from 20 to 60. We have to include in our study patients aged from 0 to 3, 3, to 6, 6, to 11, 11, to 18, you know, because the clinical problems are different. And so we have to do many experiments in very small population. with a very small amount of money. So, so this is difficult, but this data exists more or less, and we can say that psychological treatment are very technical. You have to be trained during a long time to be a psychotherapist. You know that, and now you know that there are books how to do psychotherapies, and this is quite similar than being a surgeon, in a way. So we have entered in the EBM business, like all other medical specialties. Concerning the ambivalence toward kids and adolescents, I use often this similarity between anorexia nervosa and Hodgkin disease in terms of life prognosis. It works very well. Concerning health economy, with politicians you can discuss about health economy. They understand numbers when it is euros. And so now we have data about the burden of disease, as I showed before. And concerning the anti-psychiatric movement, neuroscience can help. Because nowadays you have brain imaging. With brain imaging you have picture, and you can show to people that mental disorders are not fantasy. You can see them on the picture, like a stroke, in a way. So they understand that. They say, ah, okay. The drawback is that they say, okay, if it is the brain, so it is up to neurologists to treat the patients. So be careful about the drawbacks of neuroscience. Neuroscience. In particular, the overuse of neurodevelopmental disorder, on my point of view, is not so a good idea. I don't say that ADHD and autism are not neurodevelopmental disorder. Of course, there is something in the brain and there is something with development, so this is quite evident. But if you say constantly that mental disease are neurodevelopmental disorder, neurologists will say, okay, we take them. So we have to be cautious with that. But we didn't succeed with that anyway. We are still not heard. There is suspicion toward us. There is a stigma with psychiatrists. There have been studies about that. We are seen as cold-blooded, pretentious, dangerous. Cold-blooded, yes, because this is another drawback of neuroscience. If you focus only on the brain, then you forget that there is a patient. And people feel it. You can feel that if you see a cardiologist, you know, you say, hello, up, stethoscope and ecography and computer and a drug for hypertension and bye-bye, 200 euros. And people say that, you know, this is in all countries, people say that. Physicians do not look at us anymore. I can tell you something. I have friends that came to see me to evaluate hypnosis. They have a training in hypnosis. And they have an anesthesiologist who came to this training. And first they begin in saying, you have to sit in front of your patient and you have to see your patient with your eyes. Okay. So they did that, and they come back and they say to my colleague, hypnosis works very well. Yes, indeed. To see patient in their eyes, it works. We are pretentious, yes. Sometimes when you go to conference, to meeting, you have people who explain that we have found what is consciousness, etc., etc. So, you know, this is a very sensitive subject for people. Spirituality is an extremely sensitive subject. Religion is close to spirituality, to consciousness. If you have psychiatrists who say, we have found the reality of consciousness, of spirituality, people are afraid. And dangerous because we give medication and in some countries we give too much medication. In Canada they have been obliged to do advertisement in the general population to say that GPs shouldn't prescribe antipsychotics to adolescents who have insomnia. In some countries, you have 10% of boys aged 10 who take stimulants for ADHD. 10% who take stimulants for ADHD. I am sure that the real prevalence of ADHD in boys at that age is not 10%. And so people know that, journalists say that. And if we say that one kid on two has a mental disorder, people consider that we want to give pills to half of the population of children and adolescents. Now we come to the unseen problem. Much more, as all unseen problems, they are much more difficult to grasp. But in general, much more interesting. First, we have to do a little bit of history. There is something very strange which happened just after the Second World War. In the past, do you know what was the definition of health? The definition of health was life in the silence of the organ. That is, you are in a good health when you don't feel that you have a body. Which makes sense. Which makes sense. And you know that just after the Second World War, WHO proposed a completely different definition. As that you know, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, which is quite impossible to achieve. And imagine you could achieve that, it would be okay 5 seconds, 1 minute, and after, my God, please stop. Okay, what is surprising also, 2 years after, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has a right for the health and well-being, which is also very curious. On a philosophical point of view, how is it possible to say that a human being have a right of well-being? In particular, because most of us do not know how to be able to have this well-being. And also, which is curious, we have had to wait until a few years to have a definition of mental health. And you can see that while mental health is also a state of well-being, in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stress of life, okay, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And here there is a big problem, because in many countries now psychiatric departments are called Institute for Mental Health, because it is cute. But if this is Institute for Mental Health, these are institutes to promote well-being and to promote that children work productively and fruitfully. And so I am asking you, in your consultation, do you give risperidone, do you give methylphenidate so that children work productively? So we have to be very cautious with the term we use, because everybody uses this term nowadays. A question, why is there well-being everywhere just after the Second World War? This is a real question, because you know that mental health is on the TV, on the radio, everywhere now, and even us. We hesitate to speak about psychiatry. Sometimes we say mental health because it is less difficult to pronounce. So why? Some sociologists say that this could be the second step of modernity. You know that after at the end of the 18th century, in Great Britain, in America, with the French Revolution, there has been the modernity. The citizen become an individual. And it is said that during the third half of the 20th century, there has been a second step of modernity, with really the individual become extremely important as regards the community, and with the obligation that the individual become really somebody. And you know that your patient want to be international player, soccer player, and or singer. They have to become somebody. And it explains why sometimes they do not want to work in school, because it is impossible to become such a great person. Okay, and so well-being could be in relationship with that. I am not very convinced by that. I have another explanation which concerns the notion of reaction formation. You know perhaps not reaction formation. This is a psychoanalytic concept which corresponds to the fact that if a children or an adolescent is very shy, with some kind of social phobia, it is possible that he will become a lawyer or a politician, you know, because he or she feels that he or she has a social phobia. He is going to struggle against that, and to struggle and to struggle and to struggle, up to becoming something exactly as the opposite of what he or she was supposed to be. This is called a reaction formation. You are at the opposite of what you were supposed to be. And what happens just before the definition of health by WHO, the Second World War, with the Holocaust, with nuclear bomb. So we realize that we can do very, very naughty things. Human beings are horrible. And there is a possibility to kill the planet with nuclear bomb. So this can provide a high level of anxiety. And the reaction against this anxiety has been to promote well-being as a reaction formation. And this is all the more true at the moment that we are anxious for many other reasons, because of the climate, because of the change of the structure of family, because of the internet, because all those things we are afraid for the future of our youth. And as a reaction formation, we promote well-being, 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 and sociologists say that now we do not live in democracies but in happy crises. Politicians want everybody to be happy, and there are even hypochondriacs, people who are not maniac, but all the time happy, even when you see them. This is fake. This is fake. Okay. Now, what is the unseen problem? The unseen problem comes from three crazy equations. The first one is that this is reality, this is the postulate of our society. We can do nothing about that. Children and adolescents have a right to a good mental health. Everybody believes that. But in the vocabulary, mental health is psychiatry, even with our vocabulary. But also, psychiatry is horrible because there are pills, because there are electroconvulsive therapy and all these sort of things. And so this is not, if all children and adolescents have a right to mental health. If mental health is psychiatry, then psychiatry should be delivered to all children and adolescents. But psychiatry is crazy. So this is not possible. And so, because there are crazy equations, there has been a crazy solution. What is the crazy solution? This is like some kind of psychotic solution, which is mental health is everywhere, even if nobody what it is, and this is reality. Everybody speaks about mental health, everybody, but when you ask two people, but what do you mean by mental health? You know. So we speak about mental health, but nobody knows what it is. But during our consultation, we have real psychiatric patients, and we have no money to treat them. This is just reality. The reality is that child and adolescent psychiatry has dissolved itself in mental health. And we are in part guilty. We are in part guilty. You know, there is something very curious. There are much fewer child and adolescent psychiatrists than pediatricians. What do you see more on the TV or on the radio? Child and adolescent psychiatrist or pediatrician? Every week there is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who appear on the TV. Yeah. There is a war in Syria with radicalization. They ask to a child and adolescent psychiatrist. War and children radicalization, this is not psychiatry. This is not a mental disorder. They should ask to psychologists, not to us. This is and so we are everywhere. And when you are everywhere, you are nowhere. You do not exist anymore. You are dissolved. So what can we do against that? We have to be clear. We have to recognize that, okay, we are scared about the future of our children and adolescents. And I am a little bit too, to be honest. I am a little bit too. We live in a world, an unstable world, and in fact, I think that they are much stronger than we think they are. They are much stronger than us, according to the evolution of our planet. But anyway, I am a little bit scared about that. They have a right for a good mental health. People think that, so this is reality, okay. But we have nothing to do with that. We have nothing to do with that. First, for ethical reason. Why? Because child and adolescent psychiatrists have not to decide what is supposed to be well-being of a person. Remember what we did with homosexuality 40 years ago, 50 years ago. We decided that homosexual people didn't realize that they were unhappy and that we had to treat them for that because they had a mental disorder they ignored. And if we have the responsibility to decide well-being of people, we are very likely to do exactly the same problem. Exactly the same problem. And at the moment, there is a question of this kind with the higher part of the autism spectrum disorder. You know that some, not patients, some autistic people say, and in fact, I really think they agree. I really think they are okay. I agree with them. I have discussed with many representatives of autism. And they say, we are different, we have no disease. We are different, we have no disease. I say, okay, but... no, they say, we are different, but we need you because of this difference, we have some problem in our life. And please help us with our problem, but not help us because we are autistic. We are autistic like people who are left-handed. This is just the same thing, but because we are left-handed, we have problem to take things that are designed for right-handed people. And so, help us. And I really think they are right. They are right. At least this is a discussion with that. So, you know, we have to be very cautious with the way we treat things. And the very minimal thing is that we should not decide how people should be happy. The second point is for economical reason. If we have to provide well-being for everybody, there will be not enough child and adolescent psychiatrists and there will not be enough money. And if we spend money for all these children and adolescents, then there will be no more money for our patients. And this is what is happening at the moment. And as I said previously, I think that in this situation, psychologists are not in the same position. Psychologists can speak about well-being. There is positive psychology. I am not a fan of positive psychology. But anyway, there are papers, there are research, you can discuss and challenge the concept. The notion of positive psychiatry, in my opinion, is a little bit crazy. Even if you can use some treatment developed by positive psychology in the clinic, why not? But the concept of positive psychiatry is something as an oxymoron. And there is also a drawback of many colleagues, because they love kids, they would like to deal with all kids who suffer on the planet. And we have not to do that. This is unsustainable, untractable. You know, we have to focus on our patients. And so we have to come back to the definition of a patient. First, we have to recognize that children and adolescents have mental disease like in other medical specialty. And this has been a drawback of psychoanalysis, which considers that disease do not exactly exist and that there is a trajectory which goes there on there because this is dynamic and blah blah blah, and so the terms disease do not correspond to reality. No, no. A disease is a syndrome with which can lead to a prognosis and a treatment with some kind of etiology. You know that. This is on all textbooks. In child and adolescent psychiatry, we have syndromes which determine prognosis and treatment. You do that every day. We say etiology. Etiology. What is the etiology of leukemia, of acute leukemia? What is the etiology of acute leukemia? Nobody knows. There is no etiology of acute leukemia. And do you think that acute leukemia is a disorder? No, it is a blood disease. And even what is the etiology of PTSD? It is a trauma and a piece of genes. And we have an etiology. And nowadays, ADHD, autism, you have genes. This is a good point of neuroscience. Now we have some pieces of etiology, and even psychoanalysis gives some element of etiology. And in fact, we have too many etiologies. So we have disease. That's all. And we have to say that, and politicians have to accept that. Now, more precisely, we have to say that on one side there is well-being and mental health, on the other side you have mental disease and psychiatry, and these are two very different fields. The problem is that between both you have a gray zone. You have a gray zone with the question of inclusion, stigma, recovery, chronic disease, secondary prevention, etc., etc., etc. And this gray zone exists in all countries in different way. In different way. And it moves at the moment. It becomes something very important. Inclusion becomes something very important in most societies. So you have there three different domains. They are different, but they are interrelated and they have to work together. And this is the big deal. Concerning mental health, first, how to clarify. Now, when you will pronounce the word mental health, you will have to remember that in fact you pronounce the word well-being. Just do a CBT. When you say mental health, you say well-being. You will see, you will change your vocabulary very quickly. Mental health is about cognitive and emotional development, and this is fine, but psychiatrists have nothing to do with cognitive and emotional development. We are not giving methylphenidate for cognitive development. This is crazy, and this happens. This happens. I am sure that, and even perhaps it happens to me, you know, because it is much easier to write a prescription than to say to parents, no, I will not prescribe because the level of severity is not enough. It will take half an hour to explain why. You know, if you do the prescription, it takes 5 minutes. And so, and parents want that the school marks increase. This is cognitive enhancement. And we have not to enter in this area. Of course, there is the question of primary prevention, which is a big deal. Okay. Because prevention is good. Early prevention is even better, you know that. Autism, ADHD, even schizophrenia nowadays, many papers about that. And we know how to do prevention. For instance, trauma and violence. You know that intrafamilial violence is a huge risk factor of everything. The level, and this is the only thing which makes that psychoanalysts and neuroscientists agree. Trauma is not good for the brain and the mind. So we have to do parenting support, teacher training, to struggle against domestic violence. Okay, but we are all concerned. This is not a psychiatric problem. This is a society problem. This is a problem for politicians, not for us. We can testify. We can say that in our consultation we see migrants. We see people who suffer from violence. We can say there is a problem, but we say that as unlighted citizens. I testify, I see that, and I have to say that this is not good. And after, I stay apart. If the society does not want to struggle against violence, this is a problem of the politician. We are in a democracy. We have not to substitute ourselves to the politician. If we do that, they do not like us. About the gray zone. First, indeed, there is a conceptual clarification that is required, because at the moment, we are speaking about sub-stressful problems, disability, inclusion, empowerment, chronic disease management, secondary prevention, functioning, recovery. All these words are merged in a mess, and we don't know exactly who is going to deal with all those sort of things. What is sure is that multidisciplinarity is a necessity. Task shifting also. And my point of view is that psychiatrists are not in the best position to deal with that. Why? Because to deal with this gray zone, you have to be at the level of the patient, of the family. And because we are physicians, we are not in this position. A physician has an authority which is given by society. Especially psychiatrists. We can put people in hospital against their willingness. And people know that. They know we have an authority. That's life. And to deal with inclusion, with all sorts of things, authority is not good. You have to be with people at the same level. You have to share their experience, and we are not good at that. Nurses are much better. Social workers are much better than us. So we can collaborate. Of course, we have to collaborate for secondary prevention, for instance. We have to be part of the job. But we have to learn not to be the boss. They have to be the boss. And we are not used not to be the boss. But you know, and we have so many things to do with our patients that forget this gray zone. This is not for us. Of course, parents and patients have a major role to play, and this happens in most countries at the moment, and it will happen more and more. And of course, internet, e-health technologies will have a very sub-stressful problem. Now you have smartphone applications that are quite as good as low-level psychological treatments, and it costs quite nothing. So a big deal about that, with two big questions: how to organize that, and from where will come the money? From health insurance or from the taxes. And on my opinion, money shouldn't come from the health insurance, because if it comes from health insurance, it will be taken from psychiatry. About psychiatry, we have to clarify. Psychiatry is a medical specialty. It is. Nowadays, in all countries, psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and psychiatry are a medical specialty. Mental diseases are nearly like all other diseases, which is true. Psychiatric patients do exist. And the psychiatric patient is not a brain with a disease. So the question is, what is a psychiatric patient? So I propose this definition. You know, there is classically a patient, at least for some philosopher, a patient call for help for some suffering. This is the definition of a patient. If you do not call for some help for some suffering, you are not a patient. You know, and in your life, when you have a flu or a common cold, you have a disease in a way. But it is a small flu, it is a small common cold. You are not a patient. You are going to work with a mask, perhaps. This is not a big deal. That's life. That's life. But when you have a severe flu, you are in your bed, you cannot move, you cannot think, and you ask for something. You ask for some help. And there is a rupture help here in your existence, which makes that you are a patient. Of course, from time to time there is denying, of course. And of course, if you are in acute schizophrenia, you are not calling for some help, of course. But this is an exception. And in fact, even with acute schizophrenia, when you take the time to speak with the patient, he asks for some help. This is just reality. So, a patient is somebody who calls for help for some suffering, and in psychiatry, it is in the mind or behavior that there is the suffering. In cardiology, this is related to the heart. In orthopedy, it is related to a bone that is broken. In psychiatry, this is related to the mind and to the behaviors. And the specificity of child and adolescent psychiatry, you have noticed it. About half of my patient, of my new patient, when I ask them, why do you come to see me today? They look at the parents. So they do not call for some help. Autistic children, ADHD, they have not so many problems at that time. No, it is the community that calls for help and which locates the suffering in the youth. Anyway, so of course we have also to continue evidence-based medicine and neuroscience. Of course we have to continue, but we have to be careful. We have to be careful because if you do research in neuroscience, you focus on the brain. If you focus on the brain, then you will focus on medication. This is natural. And if you speak about evidence-based medicine every day, you will speak about statistics every day, so you will speak about an average patient, and you will forget that all patients have specificity, in particular cultural specificity, and it is a nonsense to propose the same treatment with people with very different culture. This is a nonsense. Even if statistics say that in average it works, if you know that your parents, the family is completely different, you have to adapt your treatment to this particular situation. And so we have to do research about that. And the question of unsustainability, which is really the main problem, because when people develop treatment, in particular non-pharmacological treatment, they are in a high-level university where there is a lot of money, and they develop very sophisticated treatment that we cannot provide in the day-to-day life because psychologists are not trained and because it costs so much that health insurance do not reimburse them. And so in many countries, governments say you have to use evidence-based treatment, okay, and child and adolescent psychiatrists come with child and adolescent with evidence-based treatment, and they say, so we ask for money, but we have no the money. So what can we do? This is your problem. And so I come to the end of the presentation. What can we do against that? About teaching. First, we have to ask ourselves, which job are we teaching? We are teaching a medical specialty for which the objective is to cure or to treat psychiatric patients who have psychiatric disease. That's it. You can do that with a public institution, like here. You can do that with a private practice, alone, as in cardiology. It depends on country. In some country, medical specialists exist only in hospital. In most countries, this is not the case. Of course, we can participate to the life of society as citizens, and we can deal with the question of inclusion of different people of society in society. This is a gray zone. We can participate with that, of course. And we will help because we have an experience about that. But this is not the core of our job. Which discipline? This is a question, as you know. Is child and adolescent psychiatry autonomous? Is it a part of pediatric? Is it, should we promote neuropsychiatry? Or should it be a specialization of general psychiatry? Everything is possible. But when you look at the burden of mental disease between 5 and 14, when you see that it is mental disease which are so important, on a public health perspective, you have to train specifically physicians for this type of disease. This is just rational. And so my guess is that the first point is likely to be the main solution in the future. And in many countries, European countries, it takes this direction. How? So not a big deal. We know how to teach. The problem is that we do not do it so well because this is the last line. Because unfortunately, many professors say that teaching is very important, but they do not do well. Because this is not so good for narcissism, you know. It is better to do research and to have paper in high impact factor journal and to go in Congress. But teaching, I love it, but this is care. Teaching is care, and so this is not so important. So we could imagine a European program. I don't know if it is a good thing, because I like also that each country has a specificity, a specific culture of child and adolescent psychiatry, so that it is possible to share difference. And anyway, if you want a consensus about what is child and adolescent psychiatry, you have an e-textbook. IACAPA provides an e-textbook which is free, and I have a conflict of interest, of course, but indeed this is a very good book. This is a very good book. I use it for my own work. Of course, there will be e-learning. We have e-learning. So, simulation are good, even if simulation in psychiatry are now okay. Simulation for child to do a clinical interview with a kid, this is not so easy. It raises, of course, difficulty. Supervision, intervention, mentoring is something very important. It takes time, of course, but this is very important. In many countries, young colleagues say that they are a little bit too alone, and they face difficult situations, and they have nobody to say that Perhaps with my husband, my wife, there are problems with my job and with my kids and with my colleague, and I am afraid not to be able to do this job, which seems so difficult to do, etc. And we have to do more about that. Having your own children, I think this is not mandatory. This is not mandatory, but you are not the same clinician when you have a kid. Definitely. Which content? There is a big question about the phenomenology is the core of training. We have to learn disease, how they are. This is the basis of medicine, and the treatments that correspond to the disease. But which phenomenology? The problem is that there is not a unique phenomenology. So nowadays we use the DSM, which is good because the DSM is not so bad. People say DSM is rubbish. This is not true. This is not so bad. This is better in adult psychiatry than in child and adolescent psychiatry. Okay, not so bad. But I think this is a crime to use only DSM. Because young colleagues consider, and this is the situation in many countries, that the reality of mental disorder is in the DSM, which is not true. The reality is nowhere. You will say there is the ICD, but the ICD is a clone of the DSM, not really interesting. Now you have the RDoC, you know, the research domain criteria, which is very challenging. This is a biological phenomenology of mental disease. It does not help so much for your patients, but it is challenging on the conceptual point of view. Perhaps you don't know the PDM, which is a psychodynamic nosography. Not so bad. Not so bad. Written by but it is international, but mainly American. Reading historical textbook is very, very, very interesting. To see how physicians in the ancient time describe the phenomenology of patients. You learn a lot. Even Hippocrates, when you read how Hippocrates defined depression, this is very moving because 2,500 years ago, he saw quite the same type of patient as we do. And it is, in cardiology, this is not sure that they have the same situation. So phenomenology is very important. Evidence-based medicine, of course, is mandatory. You have to know on a statistical point of view which are the treatments that correspond to the diagnosis. This is the basis. Then psychopathology is important to understand how, from where to come the disease. As I said, the problem is that you have many ways to deal with psychopathology in psychiatry. You have neuroscience, psychoanalysis. I think, really, you can be a good child and adolescent psychiatrist without having read any psychoanalytic textbook. It exists. But it costs nothing to read a couple of textbooks of Freud, of Melanie Klein, of Winnicott. I promise you, it is very cost efficient. And we have to remember that you have to rely yourself on several theories. And this is important, and in particular for you who belong to the younger generation, you know, theories are defense mechanism. Because when you are in front of a patient, many times they destabilize you because they are psychiatric patients. So they destabilize you. And a way to restabilize you is to use your theory to give sense to this disease. And so this is why psychiatrists love their theory. because their theory is good for them. And at the end, this is so good that you believe that your theory is the truth. And this is true for psychoanalysts and for neurobiologists. You know, they believe that they have the truth. But no. This is not true. And so for this reason, there is a need to read social and human science to try to see the global picture. You have to read anthropology, because when you read anthropology, you understand that if you have a migrant, in fact, you cannot imagine how there can be different in their mind. And so, if you speak about father, mother, grandparents, in fact, no, this is completely different. For instance, in Asia, in India, if you propose methylphenidate to a kid, the grandparents have to say that they are okay. Who says that in your daily clinical activity? We do not care really about grandparents anymore. Sociology, because sociology of family is so important. History, even management, you know, you will be manager, many of you. And we have to be trained for that. Of course, we have to learn somatic problems. We have to, there is a question, how do child and adolescent psychiatrists have to be trained in psychotherapies? It takes time, it takes money, but it makes you different in the way you interact with your patient. I would say more yes than no, but this is easy to say more and more and more. You have to learn that and that and that. At the end, there is an obesity. And anyway, and most important, you have to criticize yourself. You know, every day you see a patient, and just for one day I have to put a diagnosis in my observation. I receive a kid and well, he had conduct disorder, typically. So I write conduct disorder and I stop and say, yes, but he hit only his mother. When you say conduct disorder, does it make sense? You know, he hit only his mother. No. So you can say, okay, conduct disorder, but there is something else. And teaching for a life profession is something crucial. Is something crucial because we have it is necessary to have the same vocabulary. And in many countries, there is a problem with the training of psychologists. In some countries, this is very good. In Canada, for instance, all clinical psychologists have a PhD. They are very, in Germany, psychologists are also of a high level. In France, there is a big problem with the training of psychologists. And there is a MOOC, Essential of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry across the world, YACAPAP MOOC. The video are on YouTube, and it is designed for GP, pediatrician, nurses, and even parents. So I go quick to the end because I am too long. About research, research is a good friend of clinician. For the young colleagues, you cannot imagine if you see patients all the days, at the end you are in a burnout because you lose sense in your practice. And doing research, reading papers, help you to clarify the situation, to take a step back. And so this can be good to do research, even if you are a clinician. But if you do research that makes you happy. And not research that makes you somebody who is able to speak in a high-level congress. This is not the objective. The objective is for you to give sense to what you see. And fundamental research is not for us. Well, you can do what you want, but if you are clinicians, you have to do, this is a duty, you have to do research that are useful for real-life patients. To do research, you do not need necessarily a huge amount of money. This is not true. Don't care about the impact factor, I promise. Be careful, research strengthens ideologies, because this is a necessity. If you do research, you have to become very specialized in a certain area. And so, and at the end, and this area depends on a theory, which depends on an ideology. And so, if you do research, always in the same domain, at the end, your ideology will be very dominant. Nowadays, biology and statistics are in an ultra-dominant position. The good news is that qualitative approach are more accepted. In the ECAP, the European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the European Journal, now you can send qualitative paper. They are reviewed. 3 years ago, they were not reviewed. Now they are reviewed. Some of them are accepted. But this is the beginning. Organization, just to recall you what I say before, you know, life is very complex. You have pregnancy, life of the kids, pregnancy, school, parenting, society, genes, stigma, life events, culture, blah, blah, blah. And kids are supposed to develop well, and this is the case most often. And so, when it is fine, there is some kind of well-being, and so mental health. And to deal with that, you have primary prevention, and you can do primary prevention with mental health, and this is not psychiatry. Sometimes there is a problem, there are problems, you enter in the gray zone, you can see a psychologist, we can supervise this, okay, but this is not psychiatry. Sometimes there is not a problem, there is a rupture in life. And this is where child and adolescent psychiatry appears. And so the level of intervention is higher. And sometimes we can cure patients. We have to say that. OCD, depression, anxiety, panic attack, ADHD, anorexia nervosa, it happens. Addiction, cannabis addiction, all this, it happens frequently that we cure patients. And so, that's all, like a pediatrician. But sometimes, we have a chronic disease or residual symptoms. And so, happens the gray zone with the question of inclusion, disability, etc. But this is another job. And this is my last slide. So we can say that now that child and adolescent psychiatry is a major public health issue. This is not just some words, we have data. We are undergoing considerable change. This is true. I think humanity has never experienced a so huge amount of change. And so we are very afraid about that. And because we are very afraid, there is a rush with well-being and mental health. Okay? But this is different to psychiatry. And we have to consider that mental health, disability, psychiatric disease are related to different culture of care, different histories and epistemologies. But they have to work together. But to know how to work together, we have to know that we are different. And training, research, and organization of healthcare have to be designed according to these preliminary considerations. But I know I exaggerate. This is why I would like to discuss that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. You leave us all kind of, I guess, perplexed, thinking about all these things you say that seem to be so simple, though we kind of get the feeling, yeah, let's think about this a while. I can see people just processing, but I really would like to invite you to have questions and have a discussion. So anybody wants to add anything, ask anything about what Bruno told us about, have a discussion about some of the issues, please. Sue,
Want me to break the ice?
break the ice, please do.
I'm glad you said at the end that you exaggerated,
Yeah.
because I agree with 95% of what you said. But what you said made me happy, sad and angry in equal measure. Because if I'd have taken what you said literally, and you'd have said that to me as a teacher 40 years ago, I would not have done child psychiatry. Because I embrace the grey zone, because life exists in the grey zone. And I think doctors are doing more than the rest of public health workers, because we're paid to practice at the edge of uncertainty. And if I thought my life as a child psychiatrist was going to be seeing patient after patient after patient, and not being able to play my part in the whole, I would never have done the job, because it would have definitely burnt me out. I know you were making a point, but I think it's really important that we get the nuance of this.
Yes, I understand completely what you say, and other people told me the same. My point of view is that the time has changed, and really I think that we are not welcome nowadays in the grey zone. This is the point. We are not welcome.
So I'm going to...
I embrace the grey zone. I chair charities working with patients and users.
Yes.
I love being in the grey zone, and they seem to have respect. And I think also we risk getting behind the rest of medicine. So a world-renowned Nobel Prize-winning lung cancer specialist who does innovative therapy spends a day a week in Manchester doing lung screening in a van in the most deprived parts of Manchester, because he knows that unless he embraces the grey zone, all his magic won't make a big enough difference. So I don't know whether this is something very French, but we're in the grey zone. And I think we are.
I don't say we have not to be in the grey zone. I said we have to participate it, but we have not to be the main person in this area. We are the main person in our department, in our consultation. But in the grey zone nowadays, we are welcome as supportive, we are not welcome as boss.
Okay.
I
May I make a suggestion? Because what happens here is we're having a very nice, very interesting about what our core issues should be and whether we should move towards the grey zone. And I'm so curious, because if we don't do anything, we'll have the discussion right here, and we have a lot of trainees.
Yeah.
They are the future of our profession. So please, I'm gonna shut like these rows down for at least 5 minutes, and I'm gonna try to have you as trainees to participate in discussion, and please share your thoughts with us. Would anybody please
Thank you.
tell us how you feel about this and what you think, please?
Can I participate as a trainee right now?
Yeah,
You technically
I was
can.
a trainee, not so far.
Okay, but I'll
I
have
think
you.
we should let them.
No,
I
maybe
think
there is a
we-
point that maybe oh, sorry.
I
Really,
should
really,
let the
really,
trainees.
really, please. Yes,
but
you
there is a
can,
French
but in a
point, I
minute.
think.
Okay, so you want to come? Anybody? Yes, please. Go ahead.
Pardon, if you can translate, Elisa. Je pense qu'on n'a plus le temps en fait d'être dans les zones grises. On a trop de demandes tout simplement, et du coup on va devoir se contenter.
We didn't have enough time to be in the grey zone. and we have to concentrate on our job, on the
Yes, I do agree with you. I do agree with you, and we cost a lot of money. We cost a lot of money, and in the grey zone, people who cost less will be as efficient. So even if it is, even if some of us like to go in the grey zone, we can do that a little bit to participate, to make a link. This is necessary, but our expertise is necessary in the clinic, yes.
But if I hear you correctly, would you like to be, no, it's a question for him. And would you like to be in the grey zone? Because you said we don't have enough time anymore, but would you like to be in the grey zone?
Just to make diagnosis, if it goes to psychiatry or not. To understand, but not expert doctor interview. And that's it. Not more.
But don't you think that it's a very good way to ask questions, to say what you want to say?
But I speak for myself, so...
Okay, so but maybe we have, yes, please, go.
No, but
Please. Oh, this is hard, isn't it? Okay, so we've been talking about teaching techniques yesterday, okay? So please, literally, put your hands under your butts, sit on them, and have them participate. People, please, go ahead, thank you.
En français aussi.
Oui, oui.
Disons que il y a eu plusieurs fois où moi, par exemple, j'ai eu l'occasion de travailler dans la grey zone. Et c'est assez agréable parce qu'en fait, on peut avoir des résultats, on peut voir que les gens vont mieux, que effectivement, c'est plutôt valorisant. Mais en effet, on voit bien que finalement, ça peut avoir des conséquences sur les patients parce que finalement, on peut moins les voir, ou alors on ne peut pas les voir, il y a des vies d'attente pas possibles. Et c'est vrai que ça pose cette question-là. C'est utile. C'est utile aussi pour voir que en fait, il y a des choses qui peuvent fonctionner. Mais est-ce que c'est pas un leurre d'une certaine manière?
So she says, so she has been working with the grey zone. It was very valorizing because she saw effects and it was, she appreciated it, but at the same time it took away from her time then with more patients and yeah, so you say both, it was nice, but it took away time from your patients then.
So it's about dividing your own resources in your own time when you have to spend the time for the patients who need your care most. And you have to decide whether to do some community work or consulting. Yeah, I can see that. Just we are into our 5-minute gap. We're only halfway there. So just please. Okay. But Anna Sophie is a trainee,
and I'm here as a
so she
trainee.
can have.
She's too late. She's a
Okay. So I'll really thank you, sir. Okay. So go ahead, and then we'll have Anna Sophie, and then we'll have please.
There are, in my opinion, there are trainees and young psychiatrists who embrace the grey zone, but probably there are as much as young psychiatrists and trainees who are a little bit afraid of this grey zone because it is tiring and we are not prepared for this kind of situations usually. And I think that working only not in the grey zone should be an opportunity. Person should have the opportunity to choose if she or he wants to participate in this grey zone. But right now, well, I don't know how it is in my country. We usually work a lot in grey zone, and yes, it isn't so cost effective, but it, yeah, of course, it is evaluating and giving a purpose. But I think we should have opportunity to choose, and people who doesn't want to work in the grey zone shouldn't.
Okay. Anna Sophie.
I thank you for the talk, and I think what I take away from it is also being aware of when you are where and what your position is. And I think that's what we need to be taught as trainees, that our function is different when we, and I do agree with you, we need to define psychiatry as a medical, this is not the grey zone, because I think what we're seeing in Denmark is, and I think this is across Europe, is everything getting blended. So it's, we can prevent children from ever entering into child and adolescent psychiatry if we just focus on the grey zone. And I think it's being aware of where we are at what point. And I think we do need to be in the grey zone, because we do need to, I like about also teaching allied professionals. I mean, we do have an expertise that we do need to pass on to the people working in the grey zone, so they can also identify the children that need to be moved into or out of the grey zone. So I think it's different roles, and maybe as trainees or as for the trainers, to make us competent to know when are we the child and adolescent psychiatrist, when are we and the expert, and when are we in the grey zone working with other people who are experts in their own way and where we're at the same level. And so it's moving up and down the levels, and I think that's a challenge. And I think it's one of the things that is frustrating a lot of trainees, at least in Denmark, where I'm coming from, is this whole mental well-being psychiatry and being in and out and the anti-psychiatry. So I think it's maybe getting that more into the training would be relevant for future psychiatrists.
Am I allowed to say anything yet?
Yes, you are. I'm sorry for being so strict
No,
about
it's
it.
fine. The joy for me of being a child psychiatrist, and I've had a great time, is the sheer muddiness of the profession. It's not that it's clear and nicely fits in boxes. It is that it is this muddy mess, and you have to learn to swim through it, okay? And you have to learn to observe patterns and begin to bring some coherence to it. You must never believe in the patterns you observe, because they're never absolute. They work for the moment. I now find myself in a position of having to look again at the curriculum framework that we put together in 2012 and think, is this fit for the future, for the next 30 years, for the people that come out of training in 5 or 6 years' time as child psychiatrists? And I have to ask myself, is the future Falisard? Is it that it is, the specialty is narrow and really shouldn't stray from its chosen path? Or is it that people are going to find themselves swimming in mud and having to enter the grey zone, and having to be very careful how they do so? But if they don't, my fear is they will burn out by the time they're 45, because the recognition of your definition of a child psychiatric patient is going up and up. And kids who would just have been ignored and pushed to one side in the past and not seen as having significant impairment are being recognised as such. And we cannot train enough child psychiatrists to deal with all of that. So we can either have them all flood into our office and die ourselves, or we have to learn to swim in mud and work out how we contribute to this second grey zone. Not take it over, not be the leaders, I agree with you about that, but contribute in a real way with our knowledge. Yeah. But the dilemma then is there is only a certain amount of training time to become a specialist, and what balance do we give to developing those sorts of skills at that time versus the central skills of recognising psychopathology, let alone with how far do you take people in terms of learning psychotherapy skills, which I completely agree with you, have all the benefits in terms of how you run the rest of your career. And that's the real dilemma, I think. And one that I hope that you as trainees, as you're coming through and are thinking about it, will be trying to work out ways for yourself of balancing those different ways of acting as a specialist.
So maybe it's, could you help us out and maybe give us at least one example of a moment in your training thus far where you had a supervisor do something that at least seemed helpful to solve this dilemma? Should I be in my clinic, stay with my own patients, have them come in, or should I reach out and try to do some prevention in the gray zone? Does any examples come to mind of a moment where you thought, okay, maybe I'm learning something here, maybe I'm trying to swim this mud Brian is talking about? Does anybody have any concrete things we could...
I'm not on that side, but I do have some personal experience. That's right.
Yes.
So when I was a trainee, and I come from Hungary, okay, and I was asked to give a series of lectures about mental health, which is an interesting issue, because I was in training for psychiatry, and this is like a gray zone thing, I think, and I did not feel comfortable. I have to say this. And I was thinking, you know, I think the main aim in training is to learn psychopathology, learn treatment, learn psychiatry. You know? So if you let trainees take too much time in the gray zone, then they will not know. I mean, how do we expect them to know how to act in the gray zone without either making too much like expertise or being very unsecure and unsure of themselves? So I think you need to learn the basics when you are a trainee, and when you learn it and you're a specialist, then you can go and try to swim against
Or maybe you
everything
can
else.
extend
And
the
you will-
training after the formal training.
Yes,
You
right.
have to, you have to.
But you have to have the basic
Yeah.
knowledge first. That's what I think you're
For me, it's,
child psychiatrist.
for me it's so interesting because I agree very much that you said that we have to get the knowledge also, I mean the broader view from sociology, phenomenology and so on. So why, if we know, let's say, our field of psychiatry and we understand better with other knowledge, why would we then keep it? So why would we just say we are on this level and we don't, you know, deal with that's
Okay.
my
Yes, but
other professions. It's not that we go down. It's just that we
no,
come
sure.
together and from different points of view and we join for some.
Sure. I didn't say that we have not to participate to the gray zone. No. For training, we have to give training to nurse, to GPs about what is to have a common language about disease, and so this is why we did the MOOC. I do agree that people have to have a culture on psychopathology, on phenomenology, on mental disease, and we have to participate to the gray zone, but to participate. Just the gray zone, you know, and this is the same for type 2 diabetes. Nowadays, you have clinics to treat patients who have a problem with their lean, their AIDS, hypoglycemia, etc. But the day-to-day problem of type 2 diabetes is to do sports, to have a cooking which is appropriate, and this is not a job of diabetologists. They do not know how to do that. They can say, you shouldn't eat that. So they can participate, they can explain what is diabetes, but they are not in the best situation to make that the daily life of diabetic patient is okay.
So for the trainees, it would be the best to, let's say, open the way for them to join with other professionals,
Exactly.
so they can see, not to be afraid of it. Not
So
to
let's
take over,
again
but
let this be a question to the trainees,
Yeah.
because we're thinking of solutions here. So first of all, dear trainees, let us be clear: there is a gray zone, there's mud, and none of us know how to swim there. Okay? So maybe that helps. Okay, so we're figuring out a way to help you at least enter it or get some experience during your training, just a little bit, so that after your training you kind of are aware that this is an option. I guess this is the level.
And that's exactly.
That's exactly the level we're here.
Yes.
So would teaching to other professions or doing some small things there, would you be comfortable with it just to give it a try? And what would you need? Or could you help us out here? Or does it feel like this is way too vague and we should shut up and get ourselves a clear head before we ask you questions? Or please help us out.
Can I put a challenge to the trainees? Because there's a whole conversation we've not had. Across medicine, AI is going forward. Google, data analytics. In the next 20 years, doctors will not be doing diagnostics across the board. It will be machines. Now, I think if we narrow too far our role, what you feared is, will we have a role and we're too expensive? We may actually be self-defeating. So I think that's the other concern I've got. You know, machines will be doing primary diagnosis. It's already there. It's already happening. We're using tools that you put through a machine.
No,
We do it in research all the time. This is. There's no query about this. The rest of the world is moving on to AI, and I think we risk to be behind.
No. In cardiology, in dermatology, AI is going to do diagnosis. In child and adolescent psychiatry,
Autism spectrum disorder is quite done too.
Doing in cancer.
No.
10 years old.
No.
Yeah.
15.
No. No. Look at what you do in your consultation. Look at what you do.
Yeah.
By far, deep learning is not able at all to do such a thing, and even nobody knows how to program the same thing. No. In dermatology, yes, in dermatology, take a photo, you scan the photo, and you scan 1 billion nevus, and you can try to find melanoma. Yes, I know how to do that. How to find if it is a mood dysregulation, a borderline personality disorder, a prodrome of schizophrenia or ADHD, nobody knows. Even this is very, even I wouldn't imagine how to enter in the modelization of such a thing at the moment. So no, perhaps I would say that psychotherapies could be done by artificial intelligence. Yes, and they are already. And there have been experiments who show that some patients at some time prefer to do psychotherapies with machines than with people. So here there is a point. But for diagnosis, wow.
Okay, just really difficult job I have here, people. Okay, so I'm going to have, because Carmen suggested she would have a kind of a final wrap-up question. Yeah, I made it a final, to have a question to the trainees, but she's going to have it in French just to make sure we have no misunderstandings. And then we're going to have coffee. Okay, we really are. So please, Carmen, go ahead. Yes.
Mais la question qui a été posée, alors peut-être c'est un peu plus facile en français, c'était est-ce que vous voudriez avoir de l'enseignement, par exemple, qui vous expose à la situation, comment